Hello, everybody. This won't be a scripted video at all. This is just going to be some thoughts, and afterwards I will be playing some selected clips of my coverage of last night's event where Charlie Kirk was killed on camera. As of now, the gunman is still at large, and nobody knows where he is, but rumors and speculation abound, and that's really what I wanted to address right now. Because while I personally think Charlie Kirk was a noxious, horrible human being, this is not a time for celebration, and I want to talk about that. Right now, if you go scroll on social media, especially if, like me, you are surrounded by a lot of left-leaning people, you see endless calls for celebration, mocking, taunting memes. You see memes being made of visceral and disgusting, quite frankly, imagery, celebrating the death of somebody that is widely deemed a fascist, or at the very least, helpful to a fascist cause. And while I completely understand the impulse to mock the death of one's political enemy, I would caution more people to hesitate in jumping to that as their first reaction. Because right now, while it is easy to mock the death of Charlie Kirk, conservatives are priming to already use this as ammunition. As I mentioned in the stream last night, his body wasn't even cold before people were declaring him a martyr for some nebulous cause, before they were already painting targets on multiculturalism or trans people as the true villain that needs to be clamped down on. And the real reason I wanted to make this intro before the rest of the video is that last night Donald Trump went on air and without any proof or knowledge of who the shooter is, what their ideology was, where they came from, began to target the entire left of the country, saying that the judicial apparatus of America will be going after the leftists and the people who stoke division or whatever, which is very funny because that's what Charlie Kirk did. Charlie Kirk was somebody who spent his entire life dedicated to the cause of stoking division, of spreading misinformation in this country. And it's for that reason I do want to make clear that I am not going to grieve Charlie Kirk. But also, I am not going to praise his death. He died as he lived. Even now, he is nothing but a tool, an ideological cudgel for them to continue using to further their political ideology, which in this case is an authoritarian overreach of power. This is not surprising to anybody who's been looking at the headlines for months as Trump has continued to expand the judicial and now Department of War into open, brazen war crimes broadcasted on social media. It's about to get worse. And this is what I really want people to understand. The ideological divide in America is formulated so that on one side, you have conservatives who, by the way, realize, we talked about J.D. Vance's comments the other day, realize that if an unimpeded election were to take place, their broadly unpopular policies would likely lead them to losing majorities. And on the other side, you have feckless liberalism, who has continued to do nothing while these conservatives run unimpeded. And now we are at a point where, whatever it turns out, the ideology of the shooter was, who the shooter was, where they came from, what their personal grudges against Charlie Kirk were, are immaterial. It doesn't matter. Because Trump, the leader of the MAGA movement, the figurehead behind it all, has already declared that it was violence from the left. And this is the problem, I think, with praising the political violence against your ideological opposition in this country. I've seen so many people talk about how political violence has no place in America, and whether you want to go all the way back to 2011 with the attempted assassination of Gabrielle Giffords, whether you want to go back to, or whether you want to go back to the two Democrat elected officials who were murdered just a couple months ago with very little fanfare from the right-wing media. It is abundantly clear that political violence does have a place in America, and one that is spreading. And if you go and look online at the first reactions of almost every conservative influencer out there, they are not the ones saying that we need to be level-headed, we need to be peaceful. The people who, like Charlie Kirk, have such close proximity to the president, to the MAGA movement, that they were helping staff Trump's current cabinet, that they were helping implement aspects of Project 2025, are now calling for open violence, suppression of their political opposition, and even using terms like war. This, of course, on the heels of Trump pushing that Overton window just a little bit more with his Apocalypse Now on Chicago meme. Meanwhile, even as they continue to call out MSNBC hosts or whatever, almost every mainstream Democrat I've seen, from AOC to Joe Biden to Barack Obama, has been completely, unequivocally condemning this violence. And to me, this feels like an actual breaking point in the ideological divide of America, where we have now reached the point that has been gestating for a long time, where you have one party, one side of the spectrum, openly calling for crushing of any dissent, targeting of minorities, and open calls for violence, particularly weaponized by the state. And the other side of that ideological spectrum is completely unequipped and unable to handle the violence that they want to enact. They have ceded the ground of strong physical opposition, or even just posturing against your ideological enemies, as something that is only for conservatives. And now we're at a point where only conservatives are openly calling for violence, lest anybody else be called a radical. And this is why I caution anybody against celebrating right now. Because at the end of the day, this doesn't help anyone, or anyone you care about, especially if you're on the left. Praising the death of Charlie Kirk might feel good in the moment, in a sick, twisted revenge sort of way. And I truly do believe it's sick and twisted. The amount of people I've seen illustrating his last moments in gory detail have me questioning a lot. It is sickening to see. I did see the video. I saw it from multiple angles because the day wasn't out and people were making meme compilations of watching somebody die live on camera. And yeah, I think that's sick. And more importantly, I think we are not ready for that reality of what political violence really looks like when it becomes normalized. And part of this reaction, I think, is that still sinking in for a lot of people. And part of it, I think, is just plain ignorance. Ignorance of what this moment actually could represent and the danger it really poses. Because Charlie Kirk being gone is not going to affect you. It is not going to affect trans rights. It is not going to move the needle back on all the people he convinced of lies about immigrants or multiculturalism, or all the times he was incredibly racist or advocated against people's rights and personhood. That damage has been done. But what it will do is allow people to continue using his ideology to bludgeon whoever they deem unworthy. And it really is that arbitrary. The amount of time it took to decry the left or Democrats or MSNBC liberals or whoever, regardless of what they actually said about Charlie, felt like this was primed and ready to go from the conservative movement. And that's not being a conspiracy theorist saying that this was, some kind of planned operation. I don't think that was the case at all. But I do think that they have been eagerly champing at the bit, waiting for something like this to happen. And I mean, you can see it right now, where unverified reports coming from Steven Crowder are now being parroted by Matt Walsh, saying that if this shooter was trans, we need to crack down on these savages. The verbiage is intentional, and you need to believe these people. Because even if they don't believe what they're saying, their audience does. Their audience has been primed to fear for their lives now at the idea of anybody who is different. And this is on the heels of an incredibly racist campaign against a mentally ill man who killed a woman on a subway this last week. Additionally, I want to say that if you haven't seen the video by now, don't seek it out. It's not worth it. You don't actually, unless you don't need to know what it looks like when somebody dies. I've now seen, thank you, X and Elon Musk's absolute lack of any compassion or standards, but I have now seen 2 people dying on video in the last couple days, just coming across my feed. I've had to watch 2 entirely different people from different backgrounds, but different parts of the world, just bleed out like snuff films. And that is alarming, that we are getting used to that kind of violence. I think it's a very dark portent of what's to come. But even more than that, I think people need to be cautioned against simply celebrating, because it doesn't help anyone except to feel good for a brief moment. And I understand that impulse, as I talk about in the video. I understand why people jump to that as their first resort, because we see people like Matt Walsh, like Charlie Kirk, like any other number of ideologically divisive profiteers who make their life, make their career on fomenting divide, on creating these divisions in this country and dividing everybody along ideological lines of who's Christian, who's not, who's really Christian, who's traditional, who's, whatever. And so to hear, and it feels so often that these people are beyond any kind of reproach or even the most mild of consequences for their actions. When you have people like Charlie Kirk, like Matt Walsh, who spend their lives inciting and encouraging stochastic terror against groups. Usually not white people, but just groups in general. And so I do understand the knee-jerk impulse to feel like someone finally got their comeuppance. But that's not the case. It is additionally true that Charlie Kirk was somebody with a family, with a daughter, 2 daughters, and a wife. And I think I've seen a lot of people not contemplating that. And not as in terms of like, oh, well, this was, somebody that we have to, you have to pay this kind of deference to his memory because that suddenly somehow makes him a good person or worth celebrating because he did the basic biological function of humans and reproduced. I don't think that's true. But the failure to recognize even that basic aspect of somebody's humanity, and again, the true cost of what political violence looks like, I think is a conversation that I'm seeing a lot of people on the left aren't ready for. And I apologize if this has been rambly, but this is what's been on my mind. As I've watched the news headlines, as I've watched the lack of any actual knowledge about the shooter do nothing to impede the conclusions, the pre-registered conclusions that they already wanted to draw about it. Even as conspiracy theorists go off and everybody's going to have their own theory about was it an inside job or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters most now is community defense. This is the same thing I've been saying for feels like years now. Last year when Trump was shot at, that's what I said. Organize with your community. Get trained. Get medical training. Get a firearm. If you are on the left, if you are a trans person, if you are a queer person, if you are a person of color, if you are of any minority that is constantly targeted for violence, who is going to be at risk of being targeted for reprisal from this event, by the way, I give it a couple days until we see some random act of violence against a trans person, a queer person, and then very little right-wing media hand-wringing about, well, we shouldn't do political violence. Well, we don't know what their agenda was, as is the case. But when the trends continue to grow of incitement of violence, of enacting that violence, kind of hard not to draw those conclusions, which is why you need to be focused on yourself, your family, your friends, and your community. And not to incite violence, but to keep them safe, to keep yourself safe. Because again, we are at a point where conservatives, the people we have seated broadly, the public square of gun rights and gun advocacy, are now advocating for open violence. And the left, the broad left, the mainstream left, the liberal class of this country, has no recourse. They have nothing to push back on except to continue to deflect and say, we don't need political violence, but that's not the way the other side sees it. And you need to understand that, because it's only going to continue mounting from here. It's only going to get worse.